Good morning, everyone. And I want to thank you for coming. Before we start, we are going to pray. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. God, our loving Father, we want to thank you for this moment. We thank you because of the grace that you have given to us to come before you. Thank you for the gift of the Holy Spirit in the church. As we continue to learn about how to listen to the Spirit of God, speaking and listening to one another, we pray that you, Lord, will give us the courage to embrace the power of your love. May we, through the grace of your Holy Spirit in us, continue to be the instruments of peace, of unity and oneness, so that people will come to know you through our witnessing, through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Good morning. You know me, I'm Fred Gwydlin. I am Plan B, because originally Michael Fiddler was going to do the introductions for our speaker, Michael Higgins, but he's away for a confirmation of one of his grandchildren. So here I am today. You know, the Catholic Church has a long history of gathering people together in councils and in synods. Some of us, and please don't make this an unkind judgment on my part, some of us remember Vatican II, right? The Ecumenical Council by Pope John XXIII, an interesting fellow from Bergamo, not far from where my dad grew up, and of course back in the 60s. That was a gathering to take a fresh look at church governance and church doctrine. And our recent experience of synodality continues that same sort of gathering and looking afresh at the church. So today we welcome Dr. Michael Higgins, who has been involved with investigating and expanding the Catholic intellectual tradition, particularly here in Canada. He's been doing that for a long time. As a teacher, a writer, a documentarian, a university president, a public speaker, an administrator, and more, his contributions to Catholic higher education have impacted the country coast to coast. He is the author and co-author of numerous books, including many bestsellers. One in particular, it was the book called My Father's Business, and that was the official biography of Gerald Emmett Cardinal Carter. And if you remember, he was former bishop here in London Diocese, and of course he went on to become the Archbishop of Toronto. You may have heard Michael's voice on the CBC because he's the documentarian, a narrator, researcher, and he's given his expertise, both theological and philosophical, on programs such as Ideas, Celebration, Testament, and Man Alive. He is a regular contributor to the Globe and Mail, the Literary Review of Canada, Commonweal, and the Tablet of London. Currently, he is the Basilian Distinguished Fellow of Contemporary Catholic Thought at the University of St. Michael's College in Toronto, and the President and Vice Chancellor Emeritus at St. Jerome's University. St. Jerome's University, my alma mater. So as important and as impressive as all of this is, the most significant thing I would like to draw your attention to is the time that our paths crossed, both Rosie and my path crossed with Michael, and this was back in the 70s, the late 70s, St. Jerome's College in Waterloo. We were taking courses there, and of course we knew of his contemporaries, Doug Letson, Rudy Siebert was one of my professors, Walter Bilstein, of course, and again, this is fundamental, foundational to my upbringing in Catholicism. And so Before I turn the podium over to him, I ask for one special favor of Michael. We were a subscriber to Grail. It was an ecumenical document, a magazine, documenting all sorts of good things happening in the church. And back in 1985, he wrote an article in here about the Synod, the Extraordinary Synod, which was celebrating 20 years after Vatican II. So he and Doug Letson were over in Rome commenting and bringing to our attention the things that were happening there. And so his article here, which was very interesting, appeared in this edition of Grail. It was Volume 2, Issue 1 from March 1986. And so I'm going to ask him to do me a favor. Would you please autograph this for me? And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Michael. There you go, please.
This will be invaluable when my cause for canonization requires a relic.
Of course.
Joy to see you again, Ed. Thanks for keeping the book.
Thank you. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Michael Higgins.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you for being here. This is a lovely day, and you're probably saying to yourself, why am I sitting in church on a Saturday morning on a beautiful late spring day listening to Higgins? Well, I can't think of a greater pleasure in life, but I can imagine most of you can. So I won't belabor complex theological and political intrigues that go into making synods, but I'll give you a taste of it. What was a synod like? Now, this parish and the family of parishes that Father Augustine was telling me about were involved quite significantly in doing work preparing for the Synod on Synodality. And that's exceptional. That's not been the norm. But it's very important to know what exactly it is, because we're having some difficulty with it. I was in San Boniface in Winnipeg about a month ago, and doing a book launch of my book on the Synod. I did bring some copies of the book. Novalis was supposed to handle this, but Novalis. So what happened was talking to the Archbishop of San Boniface, who's a wonderful man, by the way, tremendously involved in the evolution of ministries and working with the people and making the archdiocese a wonderfully colorful and wonderfully global expression of the church. You may or may not know that Winnipeg is the only jurisdiction in North America that has 3 archbishops. The Archbishop of Winnipeg was Anglophone, the Archbishop of San Boniface was Francophone, and the head of the Ukrainian Catholic Church in Canada. So they have 3 archbishops in the same area. And they are very often a wonderful example of conciliarity and synodality. In fact, the Archbishop Cardinal, who was a Basilian, the only cardinal ever appointed or created, cardinals are created actually by the Pope, was George Cardinal Flaff, a Basilian father and a very distinguished medieval historian, and a friend of, well, correspondent at least, of Thomas Merton, and one of the great council fathers. So Winnipeg has an important role to play in the face of the Catholic Church in Canada. So off I went, and again, this time it was a Sunday afternoon. There weren't a great number of people there because, if they've gone to church, they've gone earlier in the morning, and coming back to listen to me wouldn't be a highlight of their life. But the important point, and it came up several times, is that synodality is great in theory, but how does it work? So look, we talk about synodality as an ecclesial project, the next great phase in ecclesiology, and the special achievement of Pope Francis. But Pope Francis is dead. He died just a few months, actually, after the end of the second session of the Synod on Synodality. So we don't know everything that was in his head. Similarly, you may remember, Pope John the 23rd, who called the Second Vatican Council in January of 1959, by June of 1963, he was dead. And then we would have Pope Paul VI having to come in and, for all intents and purposes, bring the council to its completion. So popes have a way of starting something and then just disappearing and leaving it for their successor to move it to the next phase. And that's what we're going to see with Pope Leo. Where's Pope Leo going to take synodality? What will it mean for him? For Pope Francis, synodality was a portal, an entry point for the reform of the church. Okay? Not the radical overthrowing of the church, of course not, but for reform of the church. Remember the great founders of, great reformers of the church talked about Ecclesia Semper Reformanda, the church ever reforming. As a community, as a church, we're in constant need of reform. There's nothing static. When you're static, you're dead. The primary principle of biology is life and motion. The cells move, the blood moves, courses through your veins. The cells in your brain operate. When they don't, when there's no motion, you're dead. The church is not a desiccated or atrophying structure. It's not a museum piece. It's a living organization. People would say to me, particularly in the media, I do a lot of work for the CBC, CTV, other networks and whatnot, and they would be fairly critical of the church because they didn't understand the church. They would tend to see it as a museum piece. And I said, oh, no. If it was a museum piece, it'd be at the Royal Ontario Museum or someplace, right? But it's not there, and it's not there because it actually does change. If you look at the history of the church, you see a history of change. Popes know this. Intelligent, good popes know this. But how do you deal with change when we are a church of continuity? When we are a church of fidelity to our roots, when we're a church sensitive to the sources that found us? How do you change? How does truth evolve? Where do you go with this? Well, for Pope Francis, and indeed for Pope John the 23rd before him, one of the ways is you go to the people. You go to the faithful. You try to do what Cardinal Newman did, now a doctor of the church, by the way. Pope Leo declared him a doctor of the church, which means he's one of the great teachers of the church. There's only about 24 of them in the history of the church. I can't remember the final calculation, probably in 20s, 27, 28 of them. I could be wrong on this, but they're a small core anyway. They teach us about change and how we adjust to change, and how we attempt to be faithful through change. We don't see change as the enemy. We see change as opportunity. But it has to be reasoned change, right? It's got to be change rooted in faith and understanding. So synodality is an iteration of an ecclesial model that says we take change seriously. Well, what do you do then? Well, you come together. You come together. Now, let me just give you a couple examples of what I mean, and then I'll elaborate on them a little bit. My plan is not to break out into groups to emulate a synodal process. That's impossible. We can't do it in the pews. We have to have a full day. We have to have particular questions. We've got to set up tables. Now, we can't do this. I only have a couple of hours. So what I want to do is give you a taste of synodality. Many of you already have it, but this will be more than just simply an amuse-bouche. It'll be something a little deeper than that. But let's start off with a good definition of synodality. One of the exciting events that occurred at the Synod on Synodality, and let me just step back for a minute, that process of preparing for the Synod had various phases. The local church, the national church, the continental church. Each one of these phases meant that documents were sent to Rome. Pope Francis established something called the General Secretariat of the Synod. So things would be processed in Rome, Cardinal Horek, Cardinal Grech, Sister Natalie Pecca. These are key officials in the Secretariat. So it's an elaborate process. It's not Pope Francis is thinking this up in the middle of the night and saying, let's do this. It's tiered, it's got structures, it has accountability. And he realized that a synod on synodality wasn't going to work for 1 year. So we had to have 2 sessions. Never had that before. Never had that before. So now we have 2 sessions. We had one in the fall of 2023, one in the fall of 2024, and now we're involved in a 3-year implementation phase. And in the fall of 27, I think, 27 or 28, 27, there will be what is called an ecclesial assembly, in which they will draw all the experience from the implementation phase from the local, the national, and international continental churches. And so there'll be this big gathering in Rome, with Pope Leo, of course, presiding. Now, when the Pope talked about synodality, he had something which no one had ever done before. In fact, there were so many things, I don't even know where to begin, just to show you how revolutionary this is. This is just not the way we did things. Synods were reinserted, if you like, into the governance of the Church in the late 1960s, 69, I think, by Pope Paul VI. He established the Synod as a not deliberative, but consultative body, an episcopal synod, meaning composed only of bishops, gathering every 3 to 4 years with a particular theme and a very clear structure, okay? There are various kinds of synods: ordinary, special, and extraordinary, okay? So these are the divisions that you find. And I'm telling you this, and it's a little boring, I know, but I'm telling you this because I want to show you how Francis changed it, okay? And what it means for us sitting in the pew in this church in Simcoe, in the Diocese of London, okay? So when I went to my first synod as a journalist, you have to be credentialed to do this. You have to go through what is called La Stampa della Santa Sede, which means the press office of the Holy See. So you have to be credentialed. They vet you. They look at your background and whatever, and then they give you a badge, and you're then given access to the press office, and you can get into the aula, which is the great hall in Paul VI Hall in the Vatican. And so you need that, otherwise you can't get anywhere, okay? So there is a process. The first synod I went to was in 1985, I'd already referred to it, the Extraordinary Synod, and with Doug Letson. And you go in, and the bishops would have their daily, and there were only bishops, they would have their daily meetings. The synods would usually be 2 to 3 weeks. The Extraordinary Synod was designed to look at what happened 20 years after the end of the Second Vatican Council. Was there progress? Where were we going? Okay? So this is all grand, but it's non-communicative. You gather and you give an isolated talk. The bishops would get up. They would each have maybe 7-8 minutes for what is called an intervenzione, an intervention. They would give the little talk, then they sit down. The bishop sitting beside them wouldn't pay any attention. There was no interaction, okay? So somebody would get up and talk about polygamy in Namibia. Then somebody else would get up to talk about liturgical excesses in, I don't know, Northern Ireland or something. But they weren't necessarily connected. They were themes. There was a theme for the synod. But each intervention would come from the individual community and church. Makes sense. Makes perfect sense. But there was no interrelation. And there used to be stories told that it was so boring that when the Pope showed up, he wouldn't pay any attention to what was going on. He'd read his breviary. So one time they invited the journalists to come in, and we were called auditores, meaning we could listen, but we'd have only a one session just to see the operation, the machinery at work. And there they were, all the bishops lined up in rows, right? And then at the front would be the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, and his immediate aides, and the Pope sitting there He's not looking at a magazine, but he's praying. He's not listening. Why? Because he didn't need to listen. Because it was all worked out beforehand. It was a show. There was no real effort to understand. And you don't think the bishops didn't resent it? They resented it enormously, but they didn't say anything. Some of them would give press conferences afterwards. Cardinal Carter was very annoyed from the Synod of the Family because there wasn't the kind of interaction there should have been. Archbishop Donat Chasson of Moncton went public with the press, got into a lot of difficulty over complaints about why do they call us here when they have no intention of listening what's going on. And this is what happened every synod I attended, on the laity, on the family, on the priesthood. They were all the same. Same form, same program, same timetable. And the only time you ever found out what anyone really thought was when you went to the trattoria or the restaurants or the Italian bars and they talked to you. And then comes Pope Francis. Francis comes along and he does it entirely differently. Okay? Just to show you. First of all, he creates a synod that's not exclusively episcopal. So you have, what was it now, something in the 70s, I think something like 78 of the synod delegates were lay people, of which maybe as much as 56 of them were lay women. It never happened before. Not only that, they got to vote. That had never happened before, and nobody had ever thought of it before. So you had a synod that was not exclusively episcopal, that was representative not only of the regions of the world, but of the people of the world. Okay, this is Francis. This is unsettling, beautiful stuff. And I remember thinking when I was there, going to the press conferences, because each day there would be a press conference, and they were wonderful because they were very in-your-face, full frontal, let's talk about it, let's respond to questions. There was no censoring. There was subtlety and nuance, of course, but there was no censoring. Again, uncharacteristic of the past. Several bishops, starting with the Archbishop Cardinal Capuchin of Kinshasa, said, you know, I've been coming to synods my whole episcopal life. And when I landed on the tarmac in Rome, I knew everything was solved. This is the first time that I'm actually able to feel that I'm participating in the process of making something happen. And he wasn't the only one. There were other cardinals and bishops who had been at previous synods that talked about the freedom, what Pope Francis, using the Greek, called parisia, the freedom of the spirit, and how important it was. Now, these are the practical, logistic things that Catholics largely don't know about, right? I mean, you're not in Rome. You don't have to work through the system. You're in your parish. You're in Canada or any other, Krakow or Prague or wherever. You're in other places. But in Rome itself, the machinery of governance matters. Now, how are we going to get this? Just like going to Ottawa, right? I mean, how do you get bills through? How do you meet with parliamentarians? How do you lobby? Who's the secretary of, who's the deputy secretary of a committee? And who is the cabinet minister here? It's a whole structure. Well, there's a structure in Rome. It's just been around longer. But it's there, it's embedded. And it's tough to make change. The longer the institution is established, the greater the resistance to change. Look at the House of Windsor. Okay? The House of Windsor needed to make changes or there would be no House of Windsor. There would be no King Charles. We'd have no head of state in this country if it hadn't changed. And it was Elizabeth II that began the process of change under the pressure of her own prime minister, her first minister, Tony Blair, who told her to leave Scotland and to come to London because of the death of the princess. An incredible scene. That's when leadership rises to the surface, when you say, okay, not quite doing the right thing here. How do you preserve the institute? Because you make changes, right? You make changes. And that's true in Rome as well. So Francis initiated these remarkable changes. So you have not only do you have men and women, okay, never heard of before, you have a different structure. So rather than the tiers like you would have here in the, it's not an audience hall, but one of the halls in the synod where they held all the previous synods, it's like a semicircle. And you know, it's ranked. You go up and up and up, and then at the bottom is the Pope, and it's usually by rank. All right, so you have archbishop, you'd have cardinals, dicasterial cardinals, residential cardinals, patriarchs, metropolitans, bishop delegates, somebody right up to the top, and then at the front is the Pope. So what does Francis do? Francis said, we're not doing it this way. We're going to sit in the hall. We're going to have tables, round tables. We're going to have 10 people sitting at the table, including a relator, meaning a secretary, and a facilitator. So pretty well 12 per table. And that'll make up I forget how many tables, but there are 365 delegates, including the Pope. So you can do the math. So they're all sitting around in these tables. Now, when you're at a table, it's very different than when you're in a pew or when you're in a tiered structure, right? Because you're not concentrating necessarily on the font or the magister or whatever. You're actually talking among yourselves. So to make sure that that talking among ourselves doesn't break out into random and chaotic cacophony, they had a structure. So you had a theme you were going to talk about. You introduce yourself, and you would have heard much of this. You would probably be doing it in your own parishes. And then it would go around the circle. You'd each have a couple of minutes. The facilitator would make sure that you didn't exceed those minutes. And then you would talk about who you are, and then that people would listen. Reverent listening, punctuated by prayer and silence. In other words, no fighting. There are no adversaries. You're not sitting around a table trying to figure out how you're going to respond to what is being said. You're actually going to listen to what is being said. Now, just imagine how difficult that is. You know, I've been talking about synodality. I've written a book on it called The Synod Diary. I've published various articles on it and whatnot, but I'm not very good at it at all, as I discovered twice. We had a Waterloo Synod last June. We had lay people and priests and others coming together. And I sat at the table with everybody else, and I had my role. The facilitator had more difficulty with me than he had with anybody else, because I didn't play by the rules. Okay? I kept talking all the time. The professor in me kept coming to the surface. It was like, well, I know what the answer to this is, so I'm going to tell you. Well, no, I don't. No, I don't. And then I began to realize I'm not that the facilitator, a young former graduate student of mine, very reluctant to correct me, but insisted that we had to follow the rules. I realized I was not playing by the rules of the game. And then I began to listen. Then I began to see for the first time how difficult listening is, especially if you're seen as an authority on a subject, and you're sitting there and you're thinking, well, you know, you got that wrong, and we should have had that nuanced, and here's a wonderful example that proves your position is incorrect. That's all wrong. Oh, that's okay for a disputation. That's great for a doctoral dissertation defense. That's great in the academy, but not in the church. Not in the church. We have to listen to what people say to us. Another perfect example for me was I was walking back one day going to get the bus to take me up the Via Aurelia to take me to the place I was living, which was the large estate, actually, belonged to Cardinal Pacelli, then Pope Pius XII's family. So it was a large estate, and the Oblates of Mary Immaculate, a large religious order with a long history in Canada. That's their mother house, so that's where I would stay. And I was going up one day, and a Dutch journalist and a deacon, permanent deacon, he called me over just within the walls of the Vatican, and he said, I want you to meet this young woman. And she was with her child, and she was a strong advocate for the ordination of women in the diaconate, okay? And I have some strong views about that. And so I went over, a little reluctantly, but I went over to meet her, and I thought to myself as she was talking, she was lovely, non-controversial, non-adversarial, no conflict, just talking respectfully. And I began to think, you know, this is what synodality means. Whether you agree with someone or not is secondary to the fact that you respect them. We're all here by virtue of our baptism. We're all Catholics we're all Christians in the Catholic tradition. This is our home. It's our intellectual home, it's our spiritual home, it's our sacramental home. If a family fights all the time, it becomes riven, fragmented. People become estranged. They don't go to family gatherings anymore because there's acrimony or toxicity, or they just don't like each other, right? So if that can happen at the microcosmic level, it can happen at the macrocosmic level. So how do we get people, Catholics of different ethnicities, different professional backgrounds, different personal histories, come together under the seal of their baptism and talk in a way what Francis called conversations in the Spirit that allows us as a church to move forward? Now, in theory, we look at this and we often say, well, that's not terribly complicated. I mean, we have parish councils, we can do that. We have finance committees in the parish. Priests have presbyteral councils. They work with the bishops. The bishops have their conference called the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops. Happens all the time. Well, yes, maybe, sometimes, yes. More often than not. Things fall into disuse. They atrophy, people become too busy or occupied, then they become fractious. They set up little kingdoms or fiefdoms, and they don't really want to be part of a larger project. Oh, theoretically they are, but in actual practice, they're not. It's my church. It's never my church. It's our church. That's what the Bishop of Rome reminds us of, because the Bishop of Rome, Peter, successor of Peter, Vicar of Christ, Supreme Pontiff of the Universal Roman Church, Leo, is our leader, and he embodies unity, and he's called to preserve the unity of the church. But how do you preserve unity in the church if people are fighting among themselves? Well, Francis's way of moving forward on this was to model through the gospel and through the various communities, particularly in Latin America, that had come together to work in prayer and in conversation to deal with issues that were both ad intra, meaning internal to the church, and ad extra, meaning outside the church, but within our responsibility to bring Christ to the world. So that's a big task. Cardinal Schönborn, the Emeritus Archbishop of Vienna, a Dominican, who came to prominence for the first time publicly in 1985 at the Extraordinary Synod. Here he was at the Synod in 2003, 2023, 2024, making it very clear that this was the kind of Synod he preferred. That was quite a change for him. But he was saying at one point to those of us in the press room, he said, you know, somebody came up from the UN, from the United Nations, who was in Rome watching this. And he said, you know, Your Eminence, if we were doing at the UN, at the Assembly, and in the various committees and organizations that are ancillaries and functions, deputations of the UN, we would have no war. We would have no inequity. Because what I've seen as an outsider is that you're actually listening to each other. Not declaiming, not proclaiming, not grandstanding, not platforming, but actually listening. And it is that art of listening that's difficult, isn't it? When we get together with people whom we disagree with, and it could be on a range of issues, some of them quite severe, like medical assistance in dying, some of them far less problematic or potentially catastrophic, that deal with fiscal inequities or disagreements with the pastor or the use of young girls on the altar as acolytes, not earth-shattering stuff, right? But nonetheless, they can divide a community. Well, what's the antidote to toxicity? The antidote to the poison of division is unity. And the best example, the best vehicle for that unity is the Synod. When the end of the first session of the Synod concluded in St. Peter's Basilica, I was walking out with a fairly famous American Jesuit by the name of Thomas Rees. And I said to him, well, you know, we've been covering this now for a long time, okay, 60 days actually over the course of the 2 years. And I said, the people inside the aula, inside the hall, they're having a great time. And they'll tell us. Even the ones who were fairly cynical when they first arrived, thought, oh God, we have to go through this. This was Francis's idea, but he is the Pope, so we'll tolerate it and whatever. Came on side, because the process took over. And I said to him, well, you know, 365 people had a great time over 2 years. What are we going to do with the other 1.4 billion Catholics? How are we going to bring them into a synodal experience? And he said, look, Michael, in my earlier life, I was a political scientist. And I got to tell you, implementation process depends on leadership. It depends on the leaders, okay? Who are the leaders? Are they going to make it happen? Because they can call people together, they can set up the structure, then they have to be open to the movement of the Spirit. And very often, we're not comfortable with the movements of the Spirit because they may take us in directions we think are false. Right? But Francis had great trust in the power of the Spirit. Had great trust in the power of the Spirit. A perfect example of this is what happened at the end of the second session. At the end of a synod, what you have are the propositiones, the propositions. They are brought forward, they're made into a report, then moved on to the Pope for the Pope's approval, and he issues a document. Okay, that's the standard process. Sometimes the document could appear, you know, a few months after the end of the synod. Sometimes you'd have to wait a year till the Pope got around to actually writing a document on the synod proper. This time, when the synod delegates came to the Pope with their reports, he accepted it. No change, no adjustment. He said, I was with you all this time, from the beginning to the end, and I accept what you recommend, I accept what you say, and this is now the official teaching of the ordinary magisterium of the Church. Unbelievable, unbelievable. That had never happened before. Never happened before. So those 2 sessions of the Synod put the Church in a new direction, or better yet, recovered the old direction. Francis knew that the Synod really isn't utterly revolutionary, because what it's doing is recapturing, re-energizing, bringing forward the Council of 1962 to 1965. We still have a lot of work to do with the Council, and the Synod is an extension of the Council. Pope Leo accepts that completely, and his various talks in Rome are a confirmation of the continuity of the Synod on Synodality with the Second Vatican Council. Now, where's that going to take us? And what does it mean? Well, in practical terms. Well, for Francis, you know, he didn't work out the perfect formulae. He didn't say, okay, by the time the Synod's finished, we'll have the following 5 things we're going to implement. In fact, many of the most contentious issues at the Synod were red flagged and then attached to study groups. So we ended up with 10, I think now, 12 study groups in Rome, drawing from expertise around the world that will be issuing separate reports, many of them have already, and they will in turn be taken back to the Synod fathers and mothers, okay, when they gather for the ecclesial assembly. Okay? So there's lots of work going on. Things didn't stop. Things didn't come to a halt. People didn't say, okay, well, that's the end of that. Or, good grief, we survived that experience. No, they realized that this is an ongoing process, and in fact, the heavy lifting is to come. I'll give you a hint. Although the cause for beatification and canonization of John Henry Cardinal Newman had begun some time ago, it was really brought to its head, to fruition, with Pope Francis. But it was Pope Leo who declared him, as I indicated earlier, a doctor or teacher of the Church. Newman is very important. He's considered to be the kind of guiding spirit of the council. Even though he died in 1890, he was very much a Victorian. Okay? He died in 1890, so that's quite a number of years before the Second Vatican Council. But the work that he did influenced so many thinkers and leaders and whatnot that when the council came together in '62, the spirit of Newman could be found hovering over the entire enclave, sometimes just implicitly rather than explicitly. But one of the things that was key to Newman's thinking was the evolution of doctrine. Doctrine changes. Catholics like to think that it doesn't. It's inalterable. What's been true is always true. Not entirely the case. We've changed our position on many things, frankly. But we don't change them by repudiating the past. We change them by incorporating new insight to enrich our understanding of the past. So it's not a cutoff, it's not a rejection of the past. It's an incorporation of the wisdom of the past with contemporary insight and understanding so that you have a larger experience of the Church and doctrine. That's the richness of it. That's why it's so important. So John Henry Newman is the abiding spirit that you continue to see in the life of the Church. And by declaring him a doctor of the Church, Leo is indicating that the importance of John Henry Newman will be constitutive of much of the thinking of the Church as it moves forward. This is not to foreclose things. It's not to say this is what's going to happen. It's not to set limits. It's to say the Church, like that phrase, Ecclesia Semper Reformanda, the Church is ever changing. But it has to change what? In continuity and in fidelity to its mission. It can't radically reorder things. It has to respond to the pain and the joys of its time and the insights of its time. I remember one time, I wrote a book on Newman, so Newman is quite close to me. And I remember on one occasion, people were saying, you know, Newman was one of the towering intellects of the 19th century. And his peers, his contemporaries were Darwin, Marx, the very early Freud, and Newman. Okay, that's quite a collection. That's quite a quartet, right? And at one point, Newman, who wrote, like many Victorians did, most Victorians did, these massive volumes. I mean, you could spend a whole year. I spent a whole year once just studying John Ruskin. He wrote 39 volumes. That was not uncommon. These great thinkers would write these massive tomes. That's what they did, right? And with Newman, when Newman became a Catholic in 1845, okay, because he was an Anglican priest beforehand, when he became a Catholic in 1845, he existed under the shadow of Rome's displeasure from 1845 to 1878. The Catholics in England and the officials in Rome didn't trust him, and they, in many ways, persecuted him. Okay? This is the great thinker, now saint of the Church. In 1878, Pope Leo XIII created him a cardinal. And as soon as he was created a cardinal, his critics pulled back. And so from 1878 to his death, Newman, who had been in so many ways considered a subject of skepticism and hyper-scrutiny and delation and all these things, was now elevated within the very church that in not a few ways had demonized him, or at least some in the church had. So he knew something about what it is to suffer for the church. God knows, rather, Henri Clé-Lesac, the famous French Dominican, said at one point, I think he was talking to Jacques Maritain, he said to him, look, you know, it is very difficult to suffer persecution in the name of the church. It is more difficult to suffer persecution at the hands of the church. And that was not an uncommon experience among the thinkers and leaders and saints of the church as they wrestled with their own institution. And we've learned a lot from this. People that we condemned, people that we silenced, now we honor. Some of them we saint, okay, we canonize them. But during their day, we either vilified them, or we ignored them, or we censored them, or sanctioned them, all right? That period in our history, I think, has gone. I think recent popes, by and large, with the exception of Benedict XV, didn't operate that way. They chose different ways of dealing with dissidents or dissent within the church. Francis doesn't support dissent in the church. He tries to end dissent in the church, and he ends it not in a heavy-fisted way, ham-fisted way, but by bringing people together. And it's true, you know, if you have a table, and I could see them, you have a table, and you have somebody from Ghana. There was this remarkable woman from Nigeria, this theologian, blow you out of the room. She was so brilliant and full of energy that all the bishops sitting at the table just, you know, froze in both fear and in admiration of this wonderful tour de force sitting at the table with them. She was, well, because she's one of them. She's a Catholic, right? So you bring people together from different parts of the world, they're sitting there, and otherwise they would never meet. They'd never meet. So if you're from Waterford and you have a rural experience of the church in southern Ontario, Canada, how does that experience stack up with somebody from a remote diocese in Australia, or somebody from Malaysia, or somebody coming from Manila, who the Catholic population is pretty well the entire population of Ontario, one city at least, if not the country? How does that work? Like, how do you talk? I mean, how do you communicate that unity of the church when you're dealing with such cultural, historical, and political diversification, right? Well, one of the ways you do it is setting up that structure of conversations in the Spirit. So you let people talk without fear of being confronted. If you're sitting at a table and you know that the person beside you or across from you holds a point of view antipathetic to yours, perhaps even hostile, you'll be reluctant to speak your heart. You won't do it. Unless you're combative and you like a good fight and you're pugilistic and you want to get right in there, that's different, then you should be in Parliament, right? But if you're a regular parishioner and you want to talk about something that's so important to you, like the role of women in the church, why your daughters don't go to church anymore, problems in the family, right? And you are a devoted Catholic parish practitioner, and you want to be able to bring that wisdom and that holiness to bear in conversation with the family. How do you do that? You know that just simply declaring something isn't going to work. My wife and I have 4 adult children. Our youngest is 36. Our oldest is 48. We can't tell them what to do. But we can listen to them, and they can listen to us. And even when we disagree, sometimes even fundamentally, we know that we're in the same tent, as Francis would call it. So how do you work towards common ground in our common home, right? How do you do that? Well, you can't do it if you're simply in a passive role, just receiving information. You have to participate. But participation doesn't mean shared authority. It doesn't. A bishop is a bishop. A pastor is a pastor. You, in your corporate or professional lives, you have authority too in your sphere, right? So they're not competing spheres. They're complementary spheres. But if you don't know what the priest thinks, the priest doesn't really know what his bishop thinks. If the people in the pews have no idea what the clergy are thinking, then how possibly can you do the mission of Christ meaningfully and credibly in a secular and often fractious world? For Francis, then, bringing people together to listen was the primary means and modality behind the synod. And this shocked people, folks. People thought there would be all these documents, big fights over women in the church, over ecclesiastical governance, over the Eastern Church's Code of Canon Law, the Western Church. No, he put these into study groups. And he turned the delegation and the synod into a retreat. This was the genius of it. Very frustrating, by the way, and I wrote quite negatively about it, because when you're a journalist covering something, you have to be able to talk to people, okay? And Pope Francis imposed what he called custody of the tongue, okay? So with the delegates, he didn't want them going out holding press conferences, doing a podcast, getting their own video and whatnot, because the other members of the synod would say, oh my God, I said something in confidence, now it's spread all over the Diocese of Peoria, Illinois. I didn't intend this. Right? So he wanted people to be able to trust the others who were at the table. So he asked them, he ordered them, don't talk outside about what's happening inside. Well, that's infuriating, because you think, well, what are we going to do? I mean, we're supposed to cover this. But he compensated brilliantly by setting up these daily press conferences. Oh, I'd gone to them before and under other synods. They were controlled, they were managed, they were uninteresting. Not anymore, not anymore. So we had all the delegates come at various times to the press office, maybe 6, 7, sitting at the front, open to all kinds of questions. The fighting that was going on, I can tell you right now, wasn't between the journalists and the delegates, or the delegates among themselves. It was the journalists fighting amongst themselves, right? Because there were journalists of the right and journalists of the left, and there were progressives and traditionalists and whatever. What a group. There was one really smart but tough young woman. You write about her in the book. And very traditional, an American, educated in Switzerland, I think, or in part of Germany. Very anti-synod, actually. She didn't like the synod. And she clearly didn't like Pope Francis, though she was not disrespectful. And she would get up at every press conference. And if she didn't ask the first question, you could make sure she was going to be there the next day to get that in. So one day during a break, we were in the one of the areas in Rome, just outside the Vatican, where they have gelato. You can buy the ice cream, and it was Rome, so it was hot, and even though it was October, it was very hot, unseasonably hot, actually. And I was standing with a couple of colleagues, and I noticed her by herself. Nobody was mingling with her. Nobody was talking to her. And I said, I'm going to go over and say something to her. And they said, oh, I don't know. No, I am. So I went over, and I said to her, I want you to know that I appreciate the candor, forthrightness, and care that you bring to your questions every day in the press office. And she, big smile, and she said to me, that you agree with me? And I said, no, I disagree with everything you've said. But I admire how you've said it and the care. And she said to me, she said, you know, I should come and punch you right in the nose, but I won't because of your Irish charm. And my friend said, you're not Irish. I said, yeah, but let's not tell her that. That's synodality, okay? I don't agree with you, but I want to hear what you say, and I want to know why you hold the position you hold. And you're just as worthy to have gelato with me as any of the other reporters, journalists, analysts, and academics all standing around the Borgo, okay? Having something to eat during a recess. Those little instances remind people again and again of the fact that in the church and in the synod, the primary condition, prior condition to any growth is this reverent listening. And it's tough. You listen, you goes around one time, all 10 people speak. Silence, prayer, reverence for the other. Then you move to the next phase, so the person's no longer introducing himself or herself. They're now talking specifically about the theme of the day, giving their opinion. Go around, so nobody's arguing with you, okay? Not yet. Go around again, same process of prayer and silence. And then the third time, engagement. Like why do you think this way? And what is your experience in your country dealing with this? And why is it different from ours? And do we have different views of anthropology? Or is this a different ecclesiology? And sometimes, you know, they would be using technical language, but more often than not, they would just be using the ordinary language of their lives and of the street. Because it wasn't really a group of academics coming together. They were delegates from all over the world, one of whom, representing Canada, was from the Diocese of London. And she was there in her capacity as somebody who had worked in education for many years, knew something about the ministry of service. That's what she brought to the conversation. Very important to bring that to the conversation. So the synod experience in Rome is what we need to do in the universal church. The challenge then is, how do we do it? Well, one of the ways we do it is precisely in front of you now. You know, here we are, talking about it, listening, reflecting on it, okay? There's no script or template, you know, when we come along and say, this is what you must do. No. This will depend on the leadership within the parish community itself. Is there an issue that we need to talk about in our prayer life, in our planning of our liturgy, in the disbursement of our monies? All these issues, and these are real issues in the parish context. We need to talk about it. We need to know. We need to have accountability. We need to have respect. How do we do that? Okay? How do we implement or put in place structures that would allow that to happen? I was saying to Father Augustine, in a conversation with an archbishop recently, he said to me, Michael, you know, among the bishops of Canada, they call synodality the S word, and they don't want to talk about it. Doesn't mean they don't believe in it. Just means they don't want to talk about it. And why don't they want to talk about it, I asked him. Why? And he says, well, fatigue, synodality fatigue, that's a condition like Trump disempowerment syndrome or something that they came up with in the States, that people just can't take it anymore. I don't want to talk about synodality anymore. It's too much, okay? Others say, well, it was a nice idea. It was Pope Francis's idea. He's gone, so we don't know what was really in his head, so what are we going to do now? Do we just drop the idea? But then Pope Leo makes it very clear that synodality is with us, and we're supposed to be a synodal church. But what's he doing? Well, he actually does something. In January of this year, he did something that hadn't been done before. He convoked what is called an extraordinary consistory, whereby he brought all the cardinals of the world to Rome for 2 days to talk to him frankly, ostensibly about 4 themes, but they realized they couldn't do 4 items in 2 days, so they cut it down to 2. He agreed with their choice. Talk frankly. Talk frankly to the College of Cardinals. Pretty important, too, because the College of Cardinals, of course, consists of the people who elected him. He says, you have to help me govern the church. And I think what Pope Leo was saying is, I can model this within my own orbit. So the rest of you should do it. Archbishops, cardinals, bishops, lay people, lay leaders, pastoral theologians, academic theologians, you should do it, okay? Because it can't be carried by the office of the Secretariat, of the Synod, can't be carried by me alone, because it is the mission of the church. It is, in fact, the church. So how do you do that then? We come back, Canadians are pretty practical. We're fairly pragmatic people. We say, okay, that's fine, that's the theory. How do we do it? Well, in talking to this Archbishop, I said, well, you know, synodality isn't scary. It's the future of the church, frankly. The German bishops, the bishops from the Low Countries, the Benelux, meaning Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, they said, look, if we're not a synodal church, there will be no church in the country. Okay? It's that critical. In other areas of the church, they said, we've been synodal all along. You know, we've been doing this in Brazil for decades. Seems new to you, but it's not new to us. Bishops in Africa saying, we've been operating in various regions of Africa synodally for a long time. We just never called it that, right? And I think that's the point, that synodality doesn't mean going out and erecting new structures. Canada's representative for the bishops, Bishop Faubert of Saint-Jean-Longueuil, who represented Canada and is our official spokesperson as bishop here in Canada, he said, well, what people expect me to do? He said, I don't have any money, I don't have any resources, I don't have any personnel, I'm a bishop of the diocese, I've got all kinds of things on my plate, and they expect me to run the show. I can't do it. Well, of course he can't. So it has to be delegated, has to be picked up by people in the community who say, well, what do we mean when we talk about synodality? How do we enact it? So I said to the Archbishop, just take the old structures and give them new life. If you have a parish council that's dead, it's the same people rotated, nobody listens, nobody cares, nobody votes, reactivate it, bring it back into life. Similarly with a finance committee, with a lay education committee, with liturgical prep committee, all these kinds. Just take the structures we have that have atrophied and invest them with new life. People will respond, and they'll respond synodally, so that when the chair of the committee, maybe the pastor, may not be, calls people together for conversation, you have a model in synodality, where you don't, first of all, start off by declaiming, attacking, not listening. You start off by embracing and listening, and as a consequence, moving forward. That's the gift of synodality. It's as simple as that. It's not complicated, but it is immensely complicated when it comes to implementing it, because it relies on our commitment as baptized Catholics to make it happen. And it can. It can be spotty. I was in Ireland recently giving a talk on my book, but also on two great mystics of the church. John Moriarty of Ireland, Thomas Merton of the United States, and how their thinking so often converged around things like archaic wisdom and ancient cultures that we've crushed. The role of indigenous peoples in our lives, talking about these things long before they became fashionable, talking about the sacramental imagination, all these things, right? Very beautiful things. So you look and you say, all right, well, how does the church flourish? It flourishes in its arts, it flourishes with its writers, it flourishes with its thinkers, it flourishes with its activists, it flourishes with its priests, who grow in holiness, hopefully, deepening their own spirituality in the process. All these things are part of the larger fabric of the church. So the initiative must come from within. You can't wait. The Irish were among the most active in the synods. They had something called the Irish Synod Pathway. And they were doing great good work. And then when I was in Dublin, I asked Jerry O'Hanlon, who is a Jesuit priest and professor, I said, how's it going? I mean, it's so wonderful what you've been doing, leading the church. And he said, yeah, we're in a crisis mode now. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, we're in chaos, in disarray. We got to work out some problems. We were doing great. Then we ran up against a wall. And I said, well, now's the time for Ignatian discernment. How do we get around the wall? What do we do next? Okay? The bishops want to have a meeting, the Irish Synod this coming fall, and the others say, no, we're not ready for it yet, and we're too divided and whatnot. But then again, this is the point. This is what a synod should be about. It should be about careful listening and discernment, right? In other areas, talking to Nathalie Pécard, a wonderful Xaverian nun from France, who became one of the principal agents of this ecclesial reform with Pope Francis. And she's only in her early 50s, I think, late 40s, remarkable woman, full of energy and light. And I said to her, sister, how is this working? She says, well, I travel all over the world into different pockets in Africa, East Asia, Melanesia, parts of Southeast Asia, and whatever. And she said, there is such life, such richness, and such resurgence of the Spirit. And she said there's other jurisdictions where it's not there at all. Just not. And in many ways, that defines the North American church. The North American church, meaning us and the United States, have put less into this project than other jurisdictions. There are reasons for that. For the Americans, it was primarily the Episcopal opposition to Pope Francis. The many American bishops, perhaps even the majority, did not like the Pope. I remember I was at a dinner in Connecticut when I was vice president of mission of the second largest Catholic university on the East Coast in New England. I was there for 10 years. I'd gone for, it was supposed to be six months, and I was there for 10 years, but anyway. And I was sitting beside the Pope's representative to Washington. They're called nuncios, papal nuncios. And it was Cardinal Pierre. And he turned to me at one point at the dinner. He was being honored. I think we were giving him an honorary doctorate or something. And he was very close to Papa Bergoglio, very close to Pope Francis. And at one point he turned to me and he said, I'm a Breton, meaning he was from Brittany. And he said, you're a Canadian, so can we talk in French for a few moments? And I said, of course we can. I said, now, my French is not as polished as yours, so it may be a little difficult conversation. He said, no, we need to have the conversation in French because I don't want the others to understand what I'm saying. I said, okay, let's go for it. But it wasn't very complicated. He was quite clear. He said, the president of this country is a crazy man. I said, well, you have agreement with me on that one. That was the first term, by the way, of Donald Trump, just the first term. And then he said, what was even more, well, not even more, but was shocking, he said, the bishops in this country don't like the Pope. I've never seen anything like this before. I've never seen anything like this before. I'm the Pope's representative, and his bishops, many of his, not all, but many of his bishops fight Francis. Okay? And that is in fact true. We have ample evidence of that. And Pope Leo has been changing various figures within the hierarchy. Cardinal Dolan, a good friend of Donald Trump, by the way, is now out, and Archbishop Hicks is now the new Archbishop of New York. There are new bishops in other dioceses. One from Guatemala is an immigrant, is now going to be working in one diocese. There's a bishop whose diocese includes Mar-a-Lago, where Donald Trump exists, who is an immigrant from Mexico. You don't think that's not deliberate? So there's stuff going on all the time. Wonderful stuff we don't see, stuff people don't talk about. The Pope had his friends and allies in the United States. Now the famous three Francis cardinals, who are also Leo cardinals, McElroy of Washington, Tobin of Newark, and Supich of Chicago. You may know of their names because they were on CBS's 60 Minutes that whipped up the President of the United States and resulted in him attacking the Pope and insulting him because of some of the things the cardinals were saying, because the cardinals were the Pope's men. So the change in the leadership in the U.S. is moving to be more pro-papal, but then anti-Francis, more pro-Leo. That helps that Leo was an American, but it also helps that he's not Francis, because for whatever reason, this hostility ran deep. That was not the experience with the Canadian Church. There are some examples of bishops indifferent to Francis, but not overtly hostile. And there were some problems that it would indicate that the Pope Francis, and the Canadian bishops weren't on the same track, or many of the bishops, not all, with the delayed visit to visit the indigenous communities. It did happen. It was one of the most successful trips of Pope Francis's entire reign, because he renamed it a penitential pilgrimage. And he came right in the heart of controversy among bishops, politicians, Canadian people, Catholics and otherwise, around the whole complex issue of the legacy of the residential schools. Great moment in the history of the Church in this country, but mostly because of Francis. There was some considerable resistance from many of the bishops, not all, not all. And in the end, the nuncio, and particularly the Archbishop of Regina, were sufficiently influential, and the Pope sufficiently determined that the coming of the Pope to Canada, though delayed, did in fact happen. And it happened in the right way. And it happened when they went over to see him first, to reiterate the invitation, and then he came to spend time with his brothers and sisters who had experienced pain at the hand of Canadian society, not just the Church. These are really important moments in the life of any national or even local church, right? And a wonderful example, again, of how Francis enacted synodality. He didn't override, he listened. And those of you who may have followed his visit to Canada will have noticed again and again, he just listened. He listened to them. He didn't just preach. Well, there were occasions when he did preach clearly, but in many instances, he just listened. With what? Reverent attention. Reverent attention. That goes a long way to heal, more than any document, more than any decree, is presence. It's charisma. That's how we bring Christ to the world, through the personal, right? Not just declaring with creeds, but most prominently through our own witness and faith. So that's what synodality does. Let me give you a couple of passages here, then maybe we can open it for a little Q&A up until... Cardinal Ratcliffe. One of the surprises at the end of one of the consistories was the fact that the Pope created new cardinals. Now, it's not surprising that he would. Popes create cardinals all the time. They change on the age limit when they can or cannot vote. It's pretty consistent now that they lose the vote at 80, but they remain cardinals, right? And they're usually held once or twice a year, pretty well always on the feast of St. Peter and Paul, the joint apostles to Rome, in the end of June. But there were other occasions as well. Francis told this occasion, and what did he do? He made Timothy Ratcliffe, not a bishop, not an archbishop, but a Dominican priest or friar who had been a spiritual architect of the synod. He had given reflections, he had helped the delegates work through prayer and through meditation during the time they were there. And at the end, the Pope created him a cardinal. Beautiful move. The other spiritual architect was a nun, a prioress or an abbess in Italy, Mother Angelini, a wonderful woman, doing very much the kind of things that Cardinal Ratcliffe was doing, not as prominently, not as substantively, but nonetheless doing a lot of the same thing, leading in prayer. So you have a man and a woman, both in religious life. I often think how wonderful it would have been if Pope Francis had created her a cardinal. Because he could have, you know. Cardinals are not, it's not a rank of priesthood. The bishop is the fullness of the priesthood. An archbishop is a bishop with additional duties, whereas the pallium is in charge of a metropolitan province or whatnot. But it's administrative, it's canonical, it's not theological. Similarly with cardinals. Cardinals are created by the Pope. They're his advisors. It was mooted for a very long time that Pope Paul VI was going to make Jacques Maritain, the very great French Catholic philosopher who was one of the founders of the Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, coming from the UN, he was going to make him a cardinal. In the end, he didn't, for whatever reason. And then Maritain died in 1973, and Pope Paul VI died in 1978, so it never happened. But a pope can create cardinals in ways that you'll be surprised, because it's a papal prerogative to create a cardinal. They're his advisors, and they have been, of course, archbishops and bishops, but and some of them in religious life. The Canadian Cardinal, Cardinal Czerny, was a Jesuit. He was not a bishop or an archbishop. No, he was ordained an archbishop before he was made a cardinal, but he didn't have that kind of pastoral responsibility. He was a Jesuit who had done great work in Central America and in Africa, was one of the founders of the Jesuit Center for Social Faith and Justice in Toronto, and happened to be a good friend of the Pope. So the Pope created him a cardinal, and he became a very important advisor during the entire Bergoglio papacy. So if Francis had created Mother Angelini a cardinal, he wouldn't have been making a statement about priesthood. Because in the 19th century, we know at least one Cardinal Secretary of State who was not a priest, or even a deacon. And we do know that Cardinal Mazarin, the successor of Cardinal Richelieu to King Louis of France, was a deacon, not a priest. We do know that sometimes popes created their own children cardinals. Pope Alexander VI created Cesare Borgia a cardinal, his son, whom he also ordained a priest. But the issue isn't orders, the issue is ministry. What is the cardinal's ministry? The cardinal's ministry is, of course, to be advisor to the Pope and to elect the next Pope. Okay? But for whatever reasons, Francis must have concluded that the Church isn't ready for this, that there isn't sufficient consensus. That's why he didn't act on the recommendation from the Amazon Synod. The Amazon Synod preceded the Synod on Synodality, and at the Amazon Synod, there was a very clear request coming from the delegates, bishops, priests, not lay people in this case, asking for the ordination of viri probati, meaning mature married men. Okay? Because the vastness of the diocese, particularly in Amazonia, Brazil, were so enormous that people might have access to the Eucharist once a year, if that. A priest would come, witness hundreds of marriages, okay, preside over numerous funerals, okay, because their numbers were insufficient. Cardinal Steiner, who's a Brazilian archbishop, at the last synod, in the press conference, he said, you know, in Amazonia, in Brazil, he said, the women are the catechists, they witness the marriages, they bury the people, okay? They do everything other than say Mass. They can't say Mass and they can't hear confessions, but they do all these other duties and responsibilities because we wouldn't have a church. There would be no church. Okay? This is how we respond in the condition in extremis, extreme conditions, right? The church finds way of responding and empowering these remarkable women, mostly, not men, but mostly women, to do these specific duties, okay? They're not ordained ministries per se, but in fact they do the work of a deacon. The cardinal said, all the work they do is the work our deacons do. We just don't call them deacons. Then we have to ask ourselves, why not? And then we remember that Pope Francis commissioned two commissions to investigate the role of women as deacons. Not talking about priests, that's not in the cards, but women as deacons. And in both cases, either the work was inconclusive or the Pope decided that it was potentially too divisive, so the committee reports weren't released, and there was some dribbling of some of the material that came out in a report issued by Cardinal Petrocchi in December of this year that just whipped up everybody. Probably not the best thing. Okay? But that's an ongoing reality in the life of the church. We can't just simply say it's not there. We may not have the right answers. We may be still in the process of consulting and listening, but we do have to do the listening. And that's why Pope Francis, realizing there wasn't consensus for the ordaining of mature married men, didn't do it. He didn't do it because he didn't think it was valuable. He didn't do it because he's the Pope, and primary charism and ministry of his role as Bishop of Rome is unity. Is unity. So he made the decision not to proceed on the recommendation. But he allowed the recommendation to come forward, and it did. These recommendations came forward again at the next two synod sessions. No decisions were made, but discussion occurred. Why? Because for Pope Francis, and I think for Pope Leo, they realized first we talk, and we listen, and we pray, and then we decide. We're not driven by ideology, we're not driven by fads, we're not driven by the latest theological movement, we're not driven by arguments that are external to the mission of the church. But before we do anything, we listen. Cardinal Newman called this the sensus fidei. And the sensus fidei, or the faith, or the sense of the faithful, is important for the church to consult. In a famous work called On Consulting the Faithful in Matters of Doctrine, published in 1859, which was the same year, by the way, that Darwin published The Origin of Species, talk about timing, Newman said, you know, there are 5 cases in the history of the church where the lay people saved the church. The bishops were veering towards heresy, or a practice that was heterodox rather than orthodox, or not in the best interest of the church, and the lay people reacted. Okay? Now, most of these occurred in the early centuries and in the medieval period, and many of them dealt with issues around liturgy, Eucharist, and Mary. Probably the finest example of it, although progressive theologians and progressives don't necessarily particularly like this, the historical fact is that when Pope Leo IX declared the Immaculate Conception of the Blessed Virgin Mary as Catholic doctrine, that's 1854, he did it after he consulted the church. He consulted the bishops consulted lay leaders and theologians. So the Pope didn't just wake up and say, well, I think we'll take the general belief in the Immaculate Conception and we'll turn it into a doctrine, into a dogma. He didn't. He spent a lot of time doing the homework. Who would have ever thought? Pius IX, of all popes. Okay. And in 1870, when the Pope declared the Pope as infallible in doctrine and morals when he speaks ex cathedra, so there were all kinds of conditions around this. Cardinal Newman wrote and identified with what are called the inopportunists. He said, I don't have any doctrinal issue per se with the Pope's new dogma, but it's not the right time. It's not the right time. And so he was identified, as indeed were various bishops and archbishops, one of whom was a bishop in Little Rock, Arkansas, was what is called an inopportunist and voted against the declaration of papal infallibility in 1870. But this is how the church works, folks. It works through consensus. When it listens, it responds. And it says, okay, so this is really what's happening on the ground level, right? A good leader always spends time listening. Good Christians always spend time listening. The Synod was a call to listening. Here's what Cardinal Ratcliffe said. A synodal church will be one in which we are formed for unpossessive love. A love that is neither abusive or cold. We should be formed for deeply personal encounters with each other in which we transcend easy labels. Love, and I love this line, love is personal. Hatred is abstract. Just think of that. Right? Just think of that. When we get worried and anxious as a community, too many immigrants coming in, they don't look like us, we can't trust them. You're in Toronto right now, you have to kind of dodge all the time on the walkway because there are all these young Punjabi men doing work for StoreDash and other things like that. Builds up resentment, and then we turn it into an abstraction. We don't know them, we've never talked to them, we've never listened to them, but we form an opinion about them. A perfect example of how egregious and demonic it is, you can see in the United States, because the government deliberately sets out to whip up the hatred. One of the reasons for the recent conflict between Pope Leo and President Trump is precisely on the way in how you deal with people. Do you whip up hatred or do you whip up healing? If you whip up hatred, you concretize your power. You center your power. When you deal with healing and listening, you decenter it. You become embracive and you take risks. But you don't build on fear. Remember Pope Francis, it's interesting, Trump didn't like Pope Francis and nor his minions, but they never attacked Francis directly. But Francis indirectly said at one point about Trump on a plane, not using the name, he said, "It's our responsibility as leaders to build bridges, not walls." And so Leo, in declaring the gospel and the gospel of peace, is doing something that is at the heart of his ministry, but is also political. I was surprised, but shouldn't have been, by various commentators and analysts and whatnot saying, oh, the Pope's not being political, he's just preaching the gospel. The gospel is political. It's not partisan, it's not ideological, but it's political. It's in the political sphere. When Pilate condemned Jesus, that was a political action. And so would many of the saints and reformers of the church. Politics isn't a dirty word, it's our reality. It's what we do with politics. Do we advance a cause of division or a cause of unity? For Pope Leo, the issue is the suffering. Oh, sure, we're all concerned about the fact that our gas is going up, but how often do you hear the administration, even our own administration in Ottawa, with our, by the way, very Catholic Prime Minister, saying, well, you know, yes, it's very concerning, the economic downturn that we're now facing because of the constraints in the port of Hormuz, but who's talking about the children being slaughtered, the blood on the streets, the endless psychological battering that will mean they'll be traumatized for their lives? That's who's speaking for them. Well, Leo was. Leo was. And their bishops, many of them. Increasingly, this is one of the, some Italians say, a miracolo. All of a sudden, the American bishops, or many of them, I shouldn't say all by any means, please, don't, these are not generalizations. The bishops who were anti-Francis are now pro-Leo, and Leo's got them all on side. Now they're supporting him. I remember he was at the Synod, Archbishop Broglio, the military vicar, and he was the president of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. And he was at the Synod, and he was sitting there beside a recently created cardinal by the name of Robert Prevost, who would of course become Pope. Now nobody knew that. Now people, various analysts and writers say, oh, I knew it was going to be an American all along. Well, I certainly didn't. And I don't think most of us did. I think it was a surprise of the Spirit, but these also move in tandem with careful planning and conversation, right, among the cardinals. But anyway, Archbishop Broglio, whom I didn't take an instant liking to, he seemed to be very imperious, and he had really well-polished cufflinks on his shirt. And was not a Francis bishop. Francis was comfortable in his skin. He wasn't concerned about how he appeared and how he was decked out. And this Archbishop Broglio, I thought, God, that's a bad choice for a president of the U.S. conference. But I got that wrong. I got that wrong. Oh, I got it right, and something happened because he had a conversion. And he, as the military vicar, his job is by and large to support unquestioningly the US military. They did the opposite. He took on Trump, he took on the Pentagon. He made it very clear that if there were soldiers who were Catholic who wanted to be conscientious objectors, who thought the war in Iran or war in Gaza was immoral, wanted to withdraw, then they should have the privilege to do so, and even said that when it comes to conflict, if soldiers have difficulty with a particular military action and wish to disengage, their conscience is primary. I've never heard this before. Never heard it from Cardinal Spellman when he was military vicar and an admiral in the US Navy. But here was this bishop saying, well, this is wrong, right? Well, why? Because his Pope made it clear and had his back. That's why. You have courage when you know you're not just standing alone, right? And I think that's one of the things that Francis learned from his Latin American experience, from his experience at the Great Salem Conference in Aparecida in Brazil, in which he was one of the document writers, that the church is a field tent. It's a hospital field tent, a military sanctuary. It's a place where the wounded go, not the privileged. It's a place where you prioritize the broken over the righteous. And if you look at it pretty closely, that's pretty well what Jesus says in the scriptures. So if Francis's radicality and his commitment to synodality strikes some as dangerous to the life of the church, they might want to go and reacquaint themselves with Jesus of Nazareth. There is then, and I should wrap it up now, there is then in the Synod a template for our future. That's why it's not scary, why it's hopeful. Well, how do we practice synodality? Well, as you leave today, you say, well, what are we going to do? Well, we're exhorted to do something. Well, there are ways, avenues of conversation. The simple fact that you're here on a Saturday morning is one. But you have families, you have work environments. Some of you are teachers or ex-teachers, and you keep in contact with your peers. There are so many different ways. I've been giving talks on synodality, not all the same by any means. And I've either had very large crowds or I've had very small ones. And the small ones sometimes are the ones held in, chancery offices or whatever. And the large ones are held in pubs. I mean, there was a Theology on Tap group that I spoke to earlier this week. The whole place on the floor was packed with people, young, old, whatever, trying to figure out what this synodality thing is. So it varies. You just have to adapt, keep the momentum going. Remember that there is no perfect template. Work with the bishop, work with the pastors, remind them, sometimes gently, shouldn't we be a little more synodal here? Okay, when it's required, right? But most importantly, recognize that the deficiencies of the church are often our deficiencies. More often than not, a poverty of imagination than it is anything else. People just become tired, or they figure that there's nothing to be done, or they become cynical, or they withdraw, or whatever. And that's what we have to resist. Because really, in the end, I have to tell you, this ecclesiology of Pope Francis, supported by Pope Leo, there'll be all kinds of nuances and whatnot, and you'll give it its own coloration, and that's important. But all of this is, in the end, the work of the Spirit, just as it was at the council. And that isn't scary. Okay, thank you. Shall we give them some time for questions, Father?
Break time.
Okay, break time.
Okay, we can move to the hall. Coffee.
Okay, sounds good.